The morning air in the valley carries the sharp, clean scent of frost on old cedar and damp earth. In the small house on Elm Street, the clock in the hallway measures the hours with a slow and steady pulse, its pendulum swinging in a rhythm as old as the floorboards beneath it. William Harper moves through the kitchen with the careful grace of a man who has spent 8 decades learning how things fit together. His silver hair is brushed back from a high forehead, and his warm hazel eyes take in the quiet room with an attention that misses nothing. He wears his favorite blue cardigan over a flannel plaid shirt, khaki trousers, and well-oiled brown leather shoes that have walked these same pavements for 30 years, their soles shaped precisely to the arches of his feet. He fills his stainless steel thermos with hot coffee, the rich aroma of roasted chicory and dark roast rising into the cool air to chase away the remnants of the night. Beside the coffee maker sits a small framed photograph of Margaret. Her smile is gentle, captured in a summer garden 50 years ago when the world felt wide and uncomplicated. Will touches the wooden frame with a weathered thumb, a gesture as automatic as breathing, performed without hesitation or sorrow. Margaret has been gone 5 winters now, and while the silence in the house is complete, it is no longer sharp. It has settled into a deep, predictable quiet that he knows how to navigate in the dark. He slides the thermos into his canvas bag, pulls on his wool coat, and steps out the front door, clicking the lock firmly behind him. The town is waking up around him in familiar, comforting ways. Chimneys send thin blue ribbons of smoke into the pale morning sky, curling against the slate roofs. Delivery trucks rumble down Main Street with heavy, steady engines, and shopkeepers unlock their heavy wooden doors, turning brass keys with familiar metallic clicks that echo off the brick facades. Will walks with a measured, deliberate stride, his hands tucked deep into his pockets to keep the morning chill at bay. He greets Mrs. Gable by the bakery with a polite nod and a tip of his chin, acknowledging the trays of warm bread she is setting out behind the glass, and he waves to the young boy delivering the morning paper who pedals past on a bicycle with rattling fenders. The park sits at the edge of the old residential district, dominated by a magnificent white oak whose branches spread wide enough to shelter half a dozen houses. Its roots push through the turf in great, gnarled knuckles that have lifted the earth around them over the course of centuries. Beneath its boughs rests a simple wooden bench, constructed of stout oak planks weathered to a silvery gray by wind and sun. This is Will's destination. He reaches it at precisely 10 o'clock every morning, just as he has done every single day since his retirement from the carpentry shop down by the canal. He sits, lowers his bag to the gravel with a soft scrape, and unscrews the cup of his thermos. The steam curls upward, dissolving rapidly into the crisp air. He watches the neighborhood move past, taking comfort in the mundane choreography of the day. A mother pushes a stroller along the paved path, her breath pluming white in the chill. 2 dogs trot ahead of their owners, noses to the ground, trailing invisible maps of scent across the grass. Across the park at the elementary school, the bell rings with a clear, brassy tone, sending a flock of children spilling out toward the swings and slides in a colorful riot of coats and laughter. Will reaches into his coat pocket and pulls out a small piece of scrap pine, salvaged from an old crate. With a pocket knife that has worn smooth in his palm over 40 years of use, he begins to shape the wood. He does not carve with haste or urgency. Each stroke of the blade removes a thin curl of white shavings that fall like snow onto his knees, piling softly in the folds of his trousers. He is looking for the wings. A bird is always hiding inside the grain, waiting for someone to clear away the excess material until only the truth remains. He knows the resistance of pine, the way knots can turn a blade if pushed too hard, the patient way the wood gives up its shape to a hand that listens. By noon, the park grows quiet again as the children return to their classrooms, their voices fading into the distance behind brick walls. Will finishes his coffee, places the plastic cup back onto the threaded top of the thermos, and sits in stillness, listening to the wind move through the oak leaves. His daughter, Sarah, called on Sunday evening from 3 states away, her voice cutting through the fiber optic lines with a bright, hurried energy that competed with the sounds of television and two teenagers arguing in the background. They talked about the weather in the valley, about her promotion at the firm where she worked long hours, about how they must all plan a proper visit soon when the schedules finally aligned. "I love you, Dad," she had said before the call dropped with a sudden digital click that left the line dead. Will had sat in the quiet kitchen for a long time afterward, holding the black plastic receiver to his ear, listening to the dial tone fade into nothingness until the automated system scolded him with a series of sharp beeps. He is not a man bitter about distance or the sprawling map of modern lives. He knows how the world pulls people outward along invisible tracks of work and ambition, drawing them towards cities where towers rise against the clouds. His children built lives where the opportunities were, just as he had built his life here among the sawmills and brickyards of the valley. But the days are long, and the evenings stretch out like empty rooms waiting for furniture that never arrives. The following afternoon, the sky hangs low and heavy with the promise of rain, the clouds the color of wet slate pressing down against the chimney pots. Will sits on his bench, the thermos resting beside him, working a piece of cherry wood into the shape of a small robin. The cherry is harder than the pine, offering a stubborn resistance that requires small, careful pressures of his thumb. When a light drizzle begins to fall, turning the gravel dark and slick, he gathers his tools, brushes the reddish wood shavings from his trousers, and heads down the path toward home. In his haste, or perhaps because the damp wood is slick in his fingers, the little carved robin slips from his pocket and lands unnoticed among the wet fallen leaves beneath the great oak. The next day brings bright, cold sunshine that glints off the puddles along the park paths, turning every drop of standing water into a mirror of the blue sky above. When Will arrives at his bench, the thermos tucked under his arm, he finds someone already occupying his space. A little girl with chestnut brown hair, hazel eyes, and a light dusting of freckles sits squarely in the middle of the oak slats, her small legs not quite reaching the ground. She wears a worn blue coat with frayed cuffs, a gray knitted scarf wrapped twice around her neck to keep out the draft, and a small backpack adorned with a faded patch of a cartoon bear. In her small mittened hand, she holds the little wooden robin Will lost the afternoon before, turning it over and over with a quiet fascination. The gravel crunches under his boots, and she looks up instantly. Her gaze is steady, assessing him with the absolute seriousness peculiar to 8-year-olds who have learned to pay attention to the world around them. "Did you drop this?" she asks. Her voice is clear and carries across the quiet grass without a trace of shyness. Will stops 3 paces away, his hands still in his pockets. He looks down at her hand, then up at her face, recognizing the small notch in the tail feathers where his knife had slipped. "I believe I did," Will says, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that matches his age and the steady weight of his years. "Thank you for finding it. It was flying away without a pilot." Lily hesitates, her eyes darting to the bird and back to his face, then slides to the edge of the bench, leaving space beside her. She places the wooden robin carefully on the wood between them, right where the grain runs straight. "My grandfather used to carve things," she says, her eyes fixed on the grain of the robin's wings as if reading a map. "He had a workshop in his basement that smelled like sawdust and hot glue and old paint cans. He made me a wooden doll with jointed arms that could sit down in a little chair he made out of clothespins." "Where is he now?" Will asks gently, taking a seat at the other end of the bench, keeping his movements slow so as not to startle her. "He lives far away, near the coast," Lily says, her shoulders dropping just a fraction as her gaze drifts toward the school across the street. "He doesn't come here much. Too many stairs in our apartment building, my mom says. She says his knees don't like climbing up to the 3rd floor after working all week at the lumber yard." Will unscrews his thermos and pours a cup of hot water with lemon, which he keeps for chilly afternoons when the damp gets into his joints. He sets the small plastic cup on the bench between them, equidistant from both of them. "Stairs are stubborn things," Will observes, watching the steam rise in the cold air. They never get shorter no matter how many times you climb them. They just wait for you to get tired. Lily offers a small, tentative smile that lights up her freckles like starlight breaking through clouds. She reaches out and picks up the robin again, turning it over in her palm to feel the smooth sanding of the breast. "How long does it take to make one of these?" she asks, looking sideways at him. "About an hour if you are in a rush and the wood is soft," Will says, leaning back against the cold slat. "About a week if you want the bird to look like it is ready to sing when you put it down on a fence post." "Can you teach me?" she asks, the question dropping into the space between them with absolute clarity. Will looks at her, really looks at her, noting the determination in the set of her chin and the way her fingers trace the carved wing as if she were trying to memorize its geometry. He thinks of his own children at that age, running through the sawdust of his shop with scraps of pine clutched in their fists. "Tomorrow," he says, his voice softening. "Bring a piece of soft pine if you have it in the house, or I can have one waiting for you here on the bench." "I have a piece of an old cedar shingle my dad took off the garage roof when he patched the leak last autumn," Lily says, her eyes brightening with sudden purpose. "It is flat and smells like rain. I can bring that in my backpack." "Tomorrow, then," Will says, lifting his cup of lemon water in a quiet salute. Over the next weeks, the bench beneath the great oak changes character entirely. It ceases to be a place of solitary waiting where an old man counts the hours until evening, and it becomes a workshop under the open sky, a place where the neighborhood congregates. Lily arrives promptly at 3:15 every school day, her backpack heavy with cedar scraps and sheets of fine grit sandpaper that smell of glue. Will provides the small folding pocket knife, supervising her grip with patient, weathered hands that step in only when the wood grain fights back against the blade. Word travels through the neighborhood the way small wonders always do, carried on the wind and through the casual conversations of parents standing at the school gates. By the second month, Lily is no longer alone on the bench. Toby, a boy from her third-grade class with scraped knees and a missing front tooth that gave his smile a crooked charm, wanders over to watch the wood curls pile up on the grass like forgotten snow. He stands there with his hands in his pockets until Will hands him a block of soft white pine and a blunt-nosed blade, teaching him how to rough out the body of a turtle whose shell can hide its head when the knife gets too close. Then comes Maya, whose mother stops to chat with Will about the damp weather and the price of winter cabbage, leaving her daughter to sit on the bench and paint small blue stars onto the wings of the sparrows Lily has finished sanding. The bench becomes an anchor for people who did not know they needed one. One afternoon, an elderly neighbor from 2 streets over brings a small wooden music box with a jammed brass cylinder, her fingers trembling slightly as she hands it to Will across the slats. "It belonged to her mother," she explains, her voice dropping into a register of private grief, "and it has not played a note since the winter freeze cracked the internal gear and silenced the tune." Will spends an hour carefully steaming the walnut housing over a kettle in his kitchen, loosening the tiny pin with a jeweler's screwdriver until the cylinder spins free and plays a thin, clear melody that makes the woman close her eyes and smile through sudden tears, remembering a parlor from 50 years ago. Another day, a brooding teenager named Marcus stands awkwardly at the edge of the gravel path, watching Will help a younger child sand a toy boat hull with a curved block of cork. Marcus stays silent until the others leave, shifting his weight from one sneaker to the other, then steps forward, pulling a broken wooden skateboard deck from beneath his arm like an embarrassing secret. "The truck snapped right through when I tried to clear the curb at the library and landed flat on the concrete," Marcus mumbles, looking down at his worn sneakers and the scuffs on the rubber toes. "My uncle said it is complete garbage now, just firewood for the stove." Will takes the deck, turning it over in his calloused hands with the practiced eye of a man who knows the integrity of laminates. The maple plies are split clean through near the rear truck mounting holes, the gray glue line exposed to the air where the wood failed under the sudden impact. "Your uncle has a good eye for garbage when he sees it broken in half," Will says mildly, looking up at the boy with a small, knowing crease at the corner of his eye. But he does not know much about lamination, or how wood remembers how it was pressed together in the factory presses. Wood is stubborn stuff. It wants to stay together. If we clean the grit out of the grain, apply fresh waterproof glue, and clamp it under pressure for 24 hours in the shed, it will hold your weight twice over when you drop back down from the ledge. Sit down on the bench for a minute. Tell me how you landed the trick before the board gave out. Marcus hesitates, surprised by the lack of a lecture, then sits down on the bench with a heavy slump of his shoulders. As Will fetches a C-clamp from his bag and explains the properties of cross-grain reinforcement, the boy begins to talk, the defensive slouch slowly leaving his spine as he realizes someone is actually listening to the mechanics of his day, treating his frustrations with the same gravity usually reserved for adult concerns. Winter gives way reluctantly to the gray winds of early spring, the frost melting from the gutters and turning the park paths into ribbons of mud. The ground softens, and pale shoots of green push through the dark soil beneath the great oak, daring the cold to return. One Tuesday, a cold, persistent rain sets in before dawn, drumming a steady, relentless tattoo against the window panes of the house on Elm Street. The sky is the color of wet slate, heavy and bruised, and a bitter wind whips through the bare branches of the maples, driving the mist horizontally across the yards. Will wakes with a deep ache in his knuckles and knees, the kind of weatherbone pain that reminds him he has lived 81 years through every kind of season the valley could muster. He sits on the edge of his bed in the gray morning light, looking out the frost-streaked window at the dreary street where no one is walking. Margaret's photograph sits on the polished walnut dresser, catching the pale morning light that struggles through the clouds. Will feels a heavy, familiar weariness settle over his chest like an old coat left out in the rain. He thinks of the cold park, the wet gravel, the biting wind that cuts right through wool and makes the eyes water. Perhaps today he will stay by the coal stove in the kitchen, read the morning newspaper from front to back, and let the afternoon pass in the warm, unbroken silence of the house where nothing is required of him. No one expects him in weather like this. The children will stay indoors with their mothers, watching the rain streak the window panes from the comfort of their living rooms. He dresses slowly, his joints protesting every movement with dull, persistent aches. He makes his coffee, pours it into the thermos, and sits at the kitchen table with a piece of toast that tastes like nothing. The silence in the room feels different today than it did before the winter began. It is no longer the peaceful quiet of a solitary life chosen by habit. It feels hollow, like an empty room waiting for a door to open that never will. He looks at his boots by the back door, caked with dried mud from yesterday's work. He thinks of Sarah's brief phone call from the weekend, the way her voice had vanished into the background noise of her distant life, as if she were speaking from the other side of an ocean. A sudden, sharp wave of doubt washes over him, cold and unsparing. All these children, all these borrowed moments on the bench under the oak, none of them are his blood. They are passing through his life like travelers changing trains at a station, chapters in a book he is only reading while someone else turns the pages. The park cannot replace a family. The bench is just wood and iron exposed to the elements. He looks down at the small cedar block left on the counter by Lily yesterday, half-shaped into an oak leaf with the veins still waiting for the V-tool. Will stands up from the table with a sudden resolve, pulls on his heavy wool coat, and takes his black umbrella from the ceramic stand by the door. He cannot leave the leaf unfinished in the middle of a vein. The park is deserted when he arrives, a vast expanse of gray grass and dripping branches. The ground is saturated, holding puddles that mirror the leaden sky without a single ripple. The great oak shivers in the wind, dropping last autumn's stubborn brown leaves into the mud where they dissolve into pulp. Will walks up the gravel path, his boots crunching softly on the wet stone. He expects to find the bench empty, cold and wet, surrendered entirely to the storm. Instead, sitting huddled under the wide brim of a bright yellow umbrella that looks like a sun dropped into the gray landscape, is Lily. Her blue coat is zipped right up to her chin, her gray scarf pulled high over her nose, and her backpack is tucked safely beneath her knees on the bench to keep it dry from the rising damp. She is staring intently at the wooden leaf Will had started yesterday, holding it in mittened hands and tracing the rough edges with the tip of her thumb. "You are early," Will says, his voice cutting through the hiss of the rain as he approaches across the gravel, the umbrella tilting to shield his eyes. "I missed yesterday because of the dentist," Lily says without looking up from her carving, her voice muffled slightly by the wool of her scarf. "And today is Tuesday. We always work on the leaf on Tuesday." Will stands over her for a moment in the driving rain, the cold wind swirling around his trouser legs and chilling the fabric against his shins. Then a slow, deep smile creases the corners of his eyes, breaking through the gray fatigue like morning sun over the ridge. He steps beneath the shelter of the oak branches, pulls a white cotton handkerchief from his pocket, and wipes the rainwater from the bench with broad, steady sweeps. He sits down beside her, opens his canvas bag, and pulls out his knife with hands that have stopped shaking. "Let me see what the weather did to your grain," he says. The storm passes by evening, leaving the town washed clean of dust and smelling of wet pine, ozone, and damp earth. By late spring, the bench has become a permanent fixture of community life, recognized by everyone from the mayor down to the youngest child starting school. Birdhouses built by Will and the children hang from the lower branches of the great oak, like tiny rustic townhouses, their small, round doors open to the sky. Finches and sparrows flit among them constantly, bringing noise and movement to the park that never seems to quiet down. The town council has even placed a neat gravel apron around the bench and added a second wooden seat to accommodate the parents, grandparents, and neighbors who gather each afternoon to watch the work unfold. On a bright Saturday in May, the light falls in long, golden slants across the grass, turning the dandelion heads into crowns of silver wire. Will is sitting at the bench, guiding Marcus through the delicate process of carving a hinge for a small cedar box that will hold a set of sketching pencils, when he hears footsteps approaching down the main path from the residential streets. He looks up, shading his hazel eyes against the late afternoon sun that glints off the parked cars beyond the hedge. A tall man in a gray sport coat that smells of travel, a woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair gathered in a loose knot, and two teenagers carrying travel bags with airline tags still dangling from the handles are walking toward the bench with purposeful strides. Will recognizes them instantly, though the years have shifted their faces and added lines of responsibility around their mouths. Sarah has silver at her temples now, just like Margaret used to, and David, her husband, looks older and kinder around the eyes. Their children, whom Will last saw when they were half their current height, tower over their parents, carrying themselves with the awkward grace of youth. Marcus steps back instinctively, sensing the shift in the electric air of the park, and quietly gathers his tools into his canvas pouch. "Go on, Marcus," Will says quietly, standing up from the bench with a slight stiffness in his knees that he no longer tries to hide. "We are finished for the day. Take the weekend off from the box." Sarah stops 10 feet away, her feet halting on the gravel path. She looks at the children gathered around the tree with pieces of wood in their hands, the birdhouses hanging overhead like fruit, the worn thermos resting on the bench, and finally at her father standing straight in his blue cardigan. Her eyes swim with sudden, unbidden tears that catch the golden light. She looks around the park, taking in the living community that has grown up around this solitary old man who had spent 5 years alone in the house on Elm Street. "We thought Grandpa was lonely," Sarah says, her voice trembling slightly as she looks from Will to the children packing their gear into backpacks. Will steps forward across the gravel, his weathered hands outstretched, his hazel eyes warm and bright with a recognition that spans decades. "He was," Will says softly, his voice steady and rich against the chatter of the sparrows in the branches above. "He was, until he decided to love the people who were already here." Sarah covers her mouth with her hand, a sob catching in her throat, before she rushes forward and throws her arms around her father's neck, burying her face in his blue cardigan while he enfolds her in his arms. David follows a second later, pulling both Will and Sarah into an embrace that spans continents and years of missed telephone calls, birthdays marked by hurried cards and silent dinners. The grandchildren stand close by, smiling shyly at the scene, before stepping in to join the circle, their tall frames bending to fit the embrace. Will looks over his daughter's shoulder at the great oak, its leaves rustling in the sweet spring breeze, and at the bench where he spent so many quiet hours waiting for a life to find him in the middle of the town. "I missed you," Will tells them gently, his voice carrying the warmth of a hearth fire on a winter night. "I missed you every single day, and I never stopped loving you, not for a single minute." "We are not leaving this weekend," David says, resting a heavy, reassuring hand on Will's shoulder. "We rented a cottage down the road by the mill stream. We are staying through Monday, all of us." "Good," Will says, a broad, radiant smile breaking across his weathered face, as he looks from his daughter to his son-in-law and down to the grandchildren who have grown into strangers he now gets to know all over again. "There is plenty of work to do before the sun goes down. I have a birdhouse that needs painting, and the kitchen table needs a proper sanding after all these years." 1 year later, on a crisp spring morning when the dew still clings to the blades of grass, the town gathers beneath the great oak in the park. The grass is thick and green, dotted with yellow dandelions that refuse to be pulled. Children run along the paths with bits of pine in their pockets, their laughter echoing through the branches where a dozen handmade birdhouses swing in the breeze, creaking softly on their brass wire hooks. Sarah and David stand near the front of a gathering with their arms around their children, while Will sits on the bench in his blue cardigan, his thermos resting beside him on the weathered oak wood, just as it always does. Margaret's memory is a quiet light in his heart, warm and unchanging, like the grain of the wood he has shaped for a lifetime. The town mayor steps forward from the crowd, holding a bronze plaque mounted on a polished block of local walnut with the screw holes pre-drilled at the corners. He speaks briefly about community, about the patience required to build something lasting out of ordinary materials, and about the man who turned a simple piece of wood and a park bench into a home for everyone who passed by. He mounts the plaque to the front plank of the bench with steady hands, securing the brass screws with a firm turn of his screwdriver until the metal sits flush against the grain. "Where kindness found a friend." The crowd applauds with a sound like rain falling on dry leaves. Children cheer, and someone hands Will a fresh cup of coffee poured from his own thermos. Will touches the cold metal of the plaque with his thumb, feeling the raised letters spell out the truth of the place he made with his own hands. The afternoon sun filters through the oak leaves, casting dappled patterns of light and shadow across the bench, the children playing on the grass, and the faces of the family who have finally learned the secret of being present in the rooms they share. Some people spend their lives building houses. William Harper built something far more lasting. He built a place where hearts felt welcome. Wherever someone feels forgotten today, may they discover that kindness still remembers their name. Until we meet again, thank you for keeping the light burning.